Hello, Tony Haymet. You're the director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And you're here at the COP to talk about new science.
That's right. Every year we come to the COP and try and pick a couple of items that we think delegates would be interested in, that perhaps we think haven't had the attention that they might have had.
So, as far as I was aware, that like science isn't old or new; it just is. What is it about why are you categorizing it as new science?
Well, because the science that we hear talked about in the Conference of the Parties often seems to me to be science from 1965. And while the basic outline of global warming and the reason that we're having these conferences was established by then, we have learned a lot in terms of technical ability to measure things. And as we all know, what gets measured gets monitored. What gets monitored gets managed.
Okay, so in terms of new science, we're now looking at measuring and monitoring. And how do you think that is developing at the moment? What is the new technology out there?
Well, I think, first of all, we're able to identify more greenhouse gases and equivalent kinds of material that trap sunlight, trap warmth. And so black carbon soot, is a material that is not even covered by the Conference of Parties because, strictly speaking, it's not a gas. But of course, most scientists believe that it's quite a large contributor, maybe 10 or 15% to global warming. And so if we were able to include that in our discussions, it might be an early win, since it's something that we like to get rid of purely for health reasons. It'd be nice to, after all these years and all the difficulty of Copenhagen and the somewhat low expectations we have this year, it'd be nice to have a success that nations could point to. And the second side of it is that our measuring technology has improved quite a lot over the years. So I think we're, about a year away from having a network around the world to actually measure regional emissions. And what I mean by that is, we all know that the concentration of carbon dioxide has risen from 280 parts per million to now 390. In fact, my institution was the first one to measure that back in 1958, and we've measured it every month since then. And so that means that for every 5 molecules of CO2 that nature put in, there are 2 more that we've added. But what we haven't done yet is to actually measure who's making the CO2. Many countries around the world have inventories where we simply add up from the bottom what everybody's car is emitting and what their ships are emitting and what their power stations are emitting. And we trust each other to do that arithmetic correctly. So I think the technology is here now where we'll be able to do a sort of a top-down actual scientific measurement. And so within a year or so, the world will be able to place scientific instruments that allow us to measure what California is emitting, or
within a year's time you'll be able to measure the emissions from California.
I think so. I think there are enough experiments going on around the world that show that that's possible.
That will have a huge influence on negotiations and how people see themselves when they come to conferences like
well,
this.
It could if it's something that everybody feels comfortable with. I mean, there were a few nations last year in Copenhagen who made a big deal about verification. And, not all other nations were very comfortable about it. I think they somehow felt that it was intrusive. Last year the discussion was around satellites, I think. The idea that Big Brother is watching from above and looking at how much, CO2 you're emitting or maybe methane. I'm enthusiastic about satellites, but I think they'll take a long time before they're calibrated properly. And even if they work, I think most scientists think we could measure CO2. Some scientists think we could measure methane, and that's probably where it stops. If we're going to have a fair and equitable system on all greenhouse gases, we really should measure all the contributions to global warming, and so that would require a monitoring system that measures the whole suite of greenhouse gases.
But this does threaten the sovereign state, though, doesn't it?
I'm sorry?
It threatens the sovereignty of the state.
If it's done from space, yeah. I mean, the way I would like to do it is to have nations voluntarily place instruments in their own territory. Maybe they'd like to offer other nations to come and verify it if that's what they feel comfortable doing. Because I think, there's nothing to be afraid of in the data. Imagine if we traded gold and we never measured how much it weighs and we never tested its purity. Well, people wouldn't have much faith in the gold trading system. And, if we're talking about having a carbon trading system that, one nation or another reduces their carbon output by a certain number of tons, or they trade the carbon, or they avoid making the carbon in some way, either by avoided deforestation or preserving their mangroves, or finding out ways to actually bury the carbon. It'd be nice to have an independent scientific verification of that, rather than relying on these bottom-up inventories.
So what do you see as the steps, the procedure to getting that in place?
Well, it's not easy, because it's not something that, again, has been discussed very much here. And so, that's why my colleagues and I are here trying to, as I said, talk about, quote, new science. I mean, I think people have to understand first that it's possible, and I think most of the delegates here don't know that. Many people were quite shocked last year when people started talking about satellites. So when we come to the Conference of the Parties, we're often not talking about science. The 194 nations who come here have pretty much decided that global warming's a problem, and most of them think that the science sort of ended magically after we measured how quickly CO2 was growing in the world. One of my missions and my colleagues is to convince people that scientists all over the world have made new discoveries, and maybe they're helpful in the rollout of the monitoring scheme and the actual details of the treaty. I mean, just to make a small point, scientists discover new greenhouse gases all the time. An example might be nitrogen trifluoride, NF3. Now, NF3 is a small contributor to global warming, but 5 years ago there wasn't much of it around. But it's a pollution made by developed countries mostly from plasma TV screens. So I didn't know anyone who had a plasma TV screen 10 years ago, so there probably wasn't much NF3. Well, NF3 has a warming potential 17,000 times that of CO2, and my colleagues have started to detect it in the global atmosphere. Well, if we, it's only 0.04% of global warming right now, but it's rising very quickly, so it's something that we would surely like to regulate. I happen to think that it's not a problem because it's valuable, and I think the manufacturers of plasma TV screens, if they know it's escaping, will probably want to capture it and recycle it, since it's worth money to them. But if we already had a treaty, we wouldn't want to sort of rewrite it just because some clever scientist had discovered that NF3 is rising in concentration and therefore contributing to global warming. So before we've actually made an agreement, it's time for the scientists to point out that we sort of need an adaptive Conference of the Party and an adaptive successor to the Kyoto Protocol, so that whatever scientific discoveries scientists around the world make, they're automatically incorporated into it, and we don't have to wait for a whole renegotiation of the whole protocol in order to cover, basic scientific facts.
And we have to start verifying as soon as possible.
I think so. Well, I mean, I think it would be helpful. I mean, now we're sort of getting in the territory that's really the negotiators. But, from the scientist's point of view, I think if you know the data, it's always better than not knowing the data. And if we can do it in a friendly and open and transparent way, maybe starting on a regional basis, maybe starting with a state of the United States and a region of Europe and a province of China, people will get comfortable with the technology, but it won't sort of threaten anybody's national identity because it won't be a whole country. But I think we do have to start getting used to the idea that science has gone a long way from just measuring the average concentrations in the whole planetary atmosphere.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.